Hey y'all! It's entry number 89 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver, Arizona Cardinals. We'll start with the positives with DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile. Established elite wide receiver. In 8 of his 9 career seasons, DeAndre Hopkins caught at least 50 passes for over 800 receiving yards. He's also caught 95 passes or more for over 1,150 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 seasons. In terms of fantasy production, in half PPR formats, DeAndre Hopkins has finished as the WR15 in 2013, with 116.2 total fantasy points and 7.3 fantasy points per game. The WR14 in 2014, with 193.0 total fantasy points and 12.1 fantasy points per game. The WR4 in 2015, with 275.6 total fantasy points and 17.2 fantasy points per game. The WR29 in 2016, with 158.4 total fantasy points and 9.9 fantasy points per game. The WR1 in 2017, with 261.8 total fantasy points and 17.5 fantasy points per game. The WR2 in 2018, with 276.0 total fantasy points and 17.3 fantasy points per game. The WR5 in 2019, with 217.5 total fantasy points and 14.5 fantasy points per game. The WR5 in 2020 with 230.3 total fantasy points and 14.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR43 in 2021 with 126.2 total fantasy points and 12.6 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. He's been one of the best wide receivers in the league for over the last decade, which makes it more intriguing to take a shot on him in fantasy drafts. The next thing I really like about DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile is that he's frequently targeted. DeAndre Hopkins has seen an average of 9.35 targets per game over the course of his career. He's seen at least 150 targets in 6 of the last 7 seasons, which is absolutely incredible. And given that Cliff Kingsbury's offense in Arizona has been pretty wide receiver friendly over the 3 years that he's been the team's head coach, it seems easy to bet on Hopkins seeing a solid workload each week when he gets back on the field. The last thing I really like about DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile is that he was still fantasy efficient in 2021. While Hopkins had a down year from a raw season totals perspective, he was still solid from a fantasy efficiency perspective. In 2021, DeAndre Hopkins averaged 0.51 fantasy points per route run, the 13th best among wide receivers, and 2.34 fantasy points per target, the 6th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. Moving on to some of the concerns with DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile. Coming off his worst statistical year, the 2021 season was arguably the worst season of DeAndre Hopkins' career, as he only played in 10 games and put up a stat line of 42 receptions on 64 targets for 572 receiving yards and 8 receiving touchdowns. His rookie year back in 2013 is the only one that was worse on a per-game basis. Considering Hopkins is only getting older, it is worrisome to see this drop-off last year. The next major concern I have with DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile is that he was suspended for performance-enhancing drugs. DeAndre Hopkins is slated to miss the first 6 games of the 2022 season after he violated the NFL's performance-enhancing drug policy. He won't be available for your team for at least 6 out of 17 regular season games, or 35.29% of the season, and in order to draft him, you will need to pass on guys who can contribute to your team all season. The last major concern I have with DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile is the fact that he's got new competition. The Arizona Cardinals traded for Marquise Brown this past offseason during the 2021 NFL season for the Baltimore Ravens. Brown had 91 receptions on 146 targets for 1,008 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. They also traded for Zach Ertz mid-season last year and it still largely remains to be seen how much that move will impact Hopkins' target share, considering Hopkins only played in 4 of the same games when Ertz was a Cardinal, in weeks 7 and 8 and weeks 13 and 14. Because of this, there's no guarantee that even when Hopkins comes back, his target share will be like it was in 2020. Some additional thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, DeAndre Hopkins finished as the WR39 in Standard, with 105.2 total fantasy points and 10.5 fantasy points per game. The WR43 in half PPR formats, with 126.2 total fantasy points and 12.6 fantasy points per game. And the WR46 in full PPR formats, with 147.2 total fantasy points and 14.7 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, DeAndre Hopkins had 1 out of 10 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 10 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 10 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 10 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 10 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, DeAndre Hopkins finished as the WR10 in Standard, with 172.8 total fantasy points and 10.8 fantasy points per game. The WR5 in half PPR formats, with 230.3 total fantasy points and 14.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR4 in full PPR formats, with 287.8 total fantasy points and 18.0 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2020 season, in half PPR formats, DeAndre Hopkins had 1 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 6 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 5 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Personal opinion: DeAndre Hopkins is currently going off the board as WR38, about pick 100 overall on ESPN, and WR35, about pick 98 overall on Yahoo. I like him as a draft target, but I think this is about the right range for him. On certain platforms where you can stash suspended players on the injured reserve, Hopkins obviously becomes more valuable. I believe NFL.com allows you to do this, since you don't have to sacrifice a bench spot for at least 6 weeks of the season. He's also an interesting target for keeper leagues this year, since there's a good chance that he's more expensive next year when he doesn't have a 6-game suspension hanging over his head. For redraft, he probably won't just instantly be a WR1 or anything when he gets back. More in the WR2 range would be my expectations based on the time off, plus the possibility of the Cardinals' new weapons eating into his target share. But he's a good dice roll at his current cost, round 9 or 10 in most leagues based on his ADP. I will probably have a few shares of DeAndre Hopkins this year if I can get him at around his current cost. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. DeAndre Hopkins' My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for Smooth. As per their website, our mission is to empower, educate, and equip survivors of domestic violence through acknowledging, preparing, and affirming their whole selves. We implement this mission through innovative, individualized, and impactful programming that meets the needs of our survivors. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.